Good evening, everyone. This is CJ Money. Welcome back. I hope everyone has had a great time celebrating the new year. This is 2022, but I would like to make this video about the events of the year 1941, particularly the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. So, without further ado, let's get to it. So, there's a lot of preceding events that led up to the attack, particularly in Europe. So, some basic background information. September the 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler, the Wehrmacht, the SS, the SA, they had invaded Poland, the Eastern European country. That was deemed kind of like the last straw for Britain and France, being the two major allies at the time, who immediately declared war. So a couple years later, the United States had yet to join the war. They had, in a sense, repeated the policies that they had before joining the fight in World War One, the conflict prior. But Roosevelt believed it was the United States' duty to help its allies in Europe, compared to President Wilson at the time getting into World War One. So obviously very different mentalities, really. So one problem I'm going to note is he didn't have Congress's support to enter the war. So instead, he had passed what's called the Lend-Lease Act. It allowed the United States to supply goods and weapons to Britain and France. So essentially, the United States was just supporting Britain and France in the war against Hitler and evidently the Mussolini as well. The conflict between the United States and Japan, however, began long before Hitler invaded Poland. In the 1920s and 30s, Japan grew to become a strong power in the East. They were an empire, or at least they were imperialistic. They wanted to expand their power, gaining resources, the whole nine yards. So one small problem. They lacked resources such as oil and rubber. The Japanese, in response to that problem, had decided to take over China, their neighbor country, across the Sea of Japan. This was the exact opposite of what the United States wanted. The United States and China were very good allies at the time. They were hand in hand with commerce and what have you. The U.S. did not want anyone controlling China's natural resources. So this kind of was like the Kickstarter. The United States was starting to get a little concerned from this whole thing. And a matter of fact, in 1931, the Japanese had decided to invade the province of Manchuria in northeastern China, much to the dismay of the United States. So they're obviously testing them, saying, well, whatever, I'm just going to invade China, no matter what you say. And Japan had gotten its oil from the United States. So they're like, well, if I was in Japan's in Japan's perspective, they're receiving resources from the United States, but they're also invading an ally of the United States. You see where this is kind of like complicated. So as a result of that, the United States has halted some of its trade agreements with Japan because they were fighting China. They didn't want to be stuck in the middle of this crossfire between China and Japan and themselves. Meanwhile, like I said, Japan was this empire. They were trying to expand it, gain resources. They were fairly militaristic in nature. Um, the country allied itself with Hitler's Germany because they saw Hitler as the best way to expand their empire and kind of keep the British and French preoccupied so that they're not fighting the Japanese, or at least not giving them as much of a hard time, because the British and French had also later on would fight the Japanese in the Southeast Pacific just as much as the Americans. Um, so in turn, the United States had chosen to stop supplying Japan with the oils and metals that Japan needed because they had allied with Germany, who was the known enemy of Britain and France, that the United States was also helping. And the United States had decided to ally itself with the leader Chiang Kai-shek. So Chiang Kai-shek was the primary leader of China at the time when it comes to the military aspect. Thanks to the Lend-Lease Act, the United States could supply weapons to Chinese troops. So this is starting to brew here. The United States is seeing what Japan's doing, so they're going to halt almost everything that they're doing with Japan and help out China and as an alternative because they're attacking their allies. And not to mention Japan had sided with Germany. So by 1941, that's when this comes in. The relations between Japan and the United States, worse than ever. I mean, there's some kind of racial tension. Economics are in the toilet, pretty much, when it comes to both nations interacting with each other. And it had seemed war would be inevitable. So President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time had written a letter to the Emperor of Japan. He thought it would be the last attempt at peace, even though they had halted most commerce with that nation. I will read somewhat briefly the actual letter. I borrowed this book from my local library. Give me one moment. So on December 6th, Franklin Roosevelt had written this letter to Emperor Hirohito. He says, His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor of Japan, so he's addressing the Emperor. Almost a century ago, the President of the United States addressed to the Emperor of Japan a message extending an offer of friendship of the people of the United States to the people of Japan. He's kind of just referring to whenever the United States began commerce and relations with Japan. This is at some point during the 1880s, 1890s. So at kind of like the backdrop of feudal Japan following the Meiji Restoration, which was the essential spiritual end of the samurai. So that offer was accepted, and in the long period of unbroken peace and friendship which has followed, our respective nations, through the virtues of their peoples and the wisdom of their rulers, have prospered and have substantially helped humanity. Only in situations of extraordinary importance to our two countries need I address Your Majesty messages on matters of state. I feel I should now so address you because of the deep and far-reaching emergency which appears to be in formation. And then he goes on talking about what's going on in the Pacific Islands specifically. The developments are occurring in the Pacific area which threaten to deprive each of our nations. He's kind of hinting at the resources and all humanity of the beneficial influence of long peace between our two countries. Those developments contain tragic possibilities. So he's saying all the events that are leading up to that point might lead to war. The people of the United States, believing in peace and in the right of nations to live and let live, have eagerly watched the conversations between our two governments during these past months. We have hoped for a termination of the present conflict between Japan and China. So he's stating that conflict, and he's kind of hoping Japan would finally back off China, that conflict would end. We have hoped that a peace of the Pacific could be consummated in such a way that nationalities of many diverse peoples could exist side by side without fear of invasion, that unbearable burdens of armaments could be lifted for them all, and that all peoples would resume commerce without discrimination against or in favor of any nation. I am certain that it will be clear to your Majesty that, as it is to me, that in seeking these great objectives, both Japan and the United States should agree to eliminate any form of military threat. This seems essential to the attainment of the high objectives. So, he's saying war may be inevitable, but we're trying to avoid it. And we're also trying to bring an end to the current conflict between Japan and China at that time. More than a year ago, Your Majesty's government concluded an agreement with the Vichy government. This is the German collaborators in France, the controlled part of France, Vichy France, by which 5,000 or 6,000 Japanese troops were permitted to enter into northern French Indochina. So this is North Vietnam, for the protection of Japanese troops which were operating against China further north. And this spring and summer, the Vichy government permitted further Japanese military forces to enter into southern French Indochina. So this is Korea and South Vietnam, that area, for the common defense of French Indochina. I think I am correct in saying that no attack has been made upon Indochina, nor that any has been contemplated. During the past few weeks, it has become clear to the world that the Japanese military, naval, and air forces have been sent to southern Indochina in such large numbers. This is kind of referring to the Japanese annexation of Korea at the time, as to create a reasonable doubt on the part of other nations that this continuing concentration in Indochina is not defensive in its character, because these continuing concentrations in Indochina have reached such large proportions, and because they extend now to the southeast and the southwest corners of that peninsula. It is only reasonable that the people of the Philippines, of the hundreds of islands of the East Indies, of Malaya, and of Thailand itself, are asking themselves whether these forces of Japan are preparing or intending to make attack in one or more of these many directions. I am sure that Your Majesty will understand that the fear of all these peoples is a legitimate fear in as much as it involves their peace and their national existence. I am sure Your Majesty will understand why the people of the United States in such large numbers look askance at the establishment of military, naval, and air bases manned and equipped so greatly as to constitute armed forces capable of measures of offense. It is clear that a continuance of such a situation is unthinkable. Yet again, that's kind of him redundantly saying war is a possibility, but we're trying to avoid it. None of the people whom I have spoken of above can sit either indefinitely or permanently on a keg of dynamite. Now that line really strikes me. He's saying that all these nations he had mentioned prior, a couple paragraphs above, that's him saying these nations, these countries, these areas of political significance, they face the threat of invasion. They don't want to be conquered either. So that's kind of what really makes it a world war. If Japan were to invade the United States and many of the territories in the Pacific, wink, wink. There is absolutely no thought on the part of the United States of invading Indochina if every Japanese soldier or sailor were to be withdrawn therefrom. So he's saying the United States won't invade Indochina if the Japanese do not occupy that area. I think that we can obtain the same assurance from the governments of the East Indies, the government of Malaya, and the government of Thailand. So those nations as well. I would even undertake to ask for the same assurance on the part of the government of China. Thus, a withdrawal of the Japanese forces from Indochina would result in the assurance of peace throughout the whole of the South Pacific area. I address myself to Your Majesty that Your Majesty may, as I am doing, give thought in this definite emergency to ways of dispelling the dark clouds. I am confident that both of us, for the sake of the peoples, not only of our own great countries, but for the sake of humanity and neighboring territories, have a sacred duty to restore traditional amity and prevent further death and destruction to the world. Great letter, but did it avoid anything? Well, we'll get to that. So, in the end, his letter begged for peace between the two countries. Of course, we know from history, the letter did not prevent that. As a result, I'm going to get now to the Pearl Harbor attack. Let's see. One moment, please. Okay. So, I had already mentioned that. Oh, yes. So, November 26th, 1941, a vice admiral in the Japanese Navy, Nagumo Chuichi, led his fleet 440 kilometers north of Hawaii. 360 planes would launch from his fleet. Meanwhile, the Pacific Fleet, the United States Navy, has been stationed on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor is located, since 1940. The two major leaders of that area, two commanders, are Navy Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Army Lieutenant General Walter C. Short. They were notified of this potential threat of attack on Thanksgiving, essentially, November 27th, the following day. However, the responses would be inadequate. And here's exactly what they did. General Short ordered an alert for sabotage. So the radar stations, so radar was a new technology at the time, and these stations would be active, but at the wrong time and the wrong direction, where it would have been a bit more effective, really, is they were placed in certain areas of that island that were in the wrong direction of Japan. And they were active at the wrong times, at nighttime, or middle of the day, you name it. And unfortunately, the attack that I will get to in a bit here, that happened quite early in the morning. So Admiral Kimmel, this is his response. He had all of his ships moored near the entire fleet in the harbor, which was what would later be known as Battleship Row. And in addition, he had sent quite a few of his personnel on leave, saying, yeah, you can go relax, go party, do whatever. And this is what leads up to the following specific day, December 7th. At 1 p.m. Hawaiian time, Japanese ambassadors had intended to meet with the Secretary of State of the United States to kind of negotiate on the terms of that letter from FDR to the Emperor, hopefully for peace. In reality, that wasn't the case. General George C. Marshall had received a telegraph. Oh, no, I'm sorry. He had received a warning about an attack and had telegraphed. No, I'm reading that wrong. I'm sorry. Had sent a telegraph to Hawaii an hour before what would become the attack. Obviously, it didn't make it in time, and that's because he received the warning late. And in fact, he was, I believe, horseback riding at that time, so he wasn't like right away reacting to it. In less than 4 hours of the attack, a Navy submarine from the Japanese was spotted by a minesweeper, I believe the USS Condin, not Condom. And another instance of warnings of attack was an Army private, George Elliott, had noticed a flight on his radar, but he had notified his lieutenant saying, "Hey, this is what's going on," but he was told to completely disregard it because there was a flight of B-17, the huge what they call Flying Fortress. The flight of those was expected that morning, so he just completely disregarded it. Obviously, that's a big what if, So at about 7:55 a.m. over Pearl Harbor, the first Japanese dive bomber appeared. It was part of a wave of about 200 aircraft. So just imagine it. You're a Marine, a soldier, or a sailor. You're either sleeping in your bunk or going out for breakfast chow bright and early on that Sunday morning, and all of a sudden you see aircraft coming over, and you don't recognize it as an American aircraft, and all of a sudden the sky is nothing but flights coming right towards you. That must have been absolutely frightening. Anyways, I'll continue on. Within a quarter hour, various airfields at the base were subjected to attack. And many of these airfields were on Ford Island and much of the rest of Oahu. 2 airfields, I believe. I can't remember the names of them off the top of my head, but I can definitely mention them in the comments if need be. Due to Army General Short's anti-sabotage measures, all aircraft were packed tightly together at the Naval Air Station on Ford Island. Obviously, a very dumb idea because that was a great target for strafing runs from the Japanese planes above. That would have been easy to destroy, as once you take one down, a whole bunch will follow. And strafing run is military terms for multiple rounds or multiple bombs coming down at once at a certain distance over time to inflict as much damage as possible. Only 6 American aircraft managed to get up in the air to combat these flights, but altogether a little over 180 were destroyed. So very successful run from the first wave of the Japanese. On the other hand, this is the ships. So the ships that were anchored in the harbor were also a perfect target for the Japanese because the ships were not fully manned. They didn't have everything up all on board, the whole 9 yards. And as a result of the attack, hardly any survived major hits, major damage from torpedoes, from dive bombs, from machine gun rounds, you name it. And I believe the ships that are most notable mentioning are the USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Utah, and the 2 that were absolutely decommissioned as a result of the attack and you can still see one of them today, is the USS Arizona. That's the big one. That's the famous one. And then the USS Oklahoma. Now, the second wave of flights came in at 8:50 in the morning, so about an hour after the first wave. It was less successful, although they still inflicted heavy damage on Battleship Row. The two or three ships mentioned here was the USS Nevada. It had managed to move because of its position in Battleship Row, but unfortunately was grounded at the head of the channel in Pearl Harbor, which made it kind of interesting. They tried to get away, but were grounded, which means they were damaged to the point of they couldn't move the ship. The USS Pennsylvania was set completely ablaze. It must have taken a long time to oust that fire. And now here's a ship that isn't mentioned very often. It's the USS Shaw. So the USS Shaw was completely split in two. So I'm assuming that a dive bomb must have hit it right in the middle. And from the pressure of the impact, must have split in two. So shortly past 9 a.m., the Japanese had finally withdrew from the attack. This is a tough one. The statistics of live personnel. As a result, it has been an estimate of roughly 2,300 personnel, Army, Marines, Navy, Army Air Corps at the time. It wasn't the Air Force. Personnel have been killed in action or wounded. The following day, December 8th, 1941, was the declaration of war. I'll get to that in a minute. And also I'll explain the backdoor to war theory, which is kind of interesting. But to finish off my point about the attack is as a result, several dispositions ordered from Admiral Kimmel made it so that three aircraft carriers were not actually at Pearl Harbor during the attack. And these three were the USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga. I believe one of those was actually in San Diego, the United States, but the other two were definitely at sea somewhere. Out of the 8 ships that were in the harbor, though, 6 out of 8 were able to be repaired and refit for service. Those 2 were obviously the Arizona and the Oklahoma, completely destroyed. There's no way that they could be revived and set ready to go. So strategically speaking, the Japanese had failed to destroy the oil facilities on the island of Oahu and most of Hawaii. That was a major target for the Japanese. Actually, as a result of that, the United States, after they had declared war, that oil was key for refueling the ships and getting the surviving aircraft, ready to go for what would be the following battles of Midway and another one that I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, absolutely. They had failed to destroy that, which would later make it increasingly vital for their own resources, the United States, to fight the first 2 battles of the war in the Pacific. So where was I? So the backdoor war theory and the bit where, so this is December 8th, 1941, the following day. President Franklin Roosevelt had addressed Congress, and by doing this address, it would declare war on Japan, which would in turn get the United States involved in the Second World War, mainly in the Pacific, but also declaring alliance with Britain and in turn France. So getting the United States to fight Germany as well in Europe. So this is this portion of that speech. It's a famous phrase, and it's also the name of this video, a date which will live in infamy. This is the president requesting that war declaration. So he says, Mr. Vice President and Mr. Speaker, and members of the Senate and House Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States. I'm trying to think of it as if he's speaking, because I've actually heard the speech in an audio version. Seems like I was trying to imitate President Roosevelt. Anyways, the United States was at peace with that nation, and that the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor. Knock, knock. That's referring to that letter he had sent, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State, I mentioned that prior, a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat of war, threat or hint of war or of armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. I had mentioned that statistic moments ago. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed in the high seas between San Francisco, California, and Honolulu, Hawaii. And this is what follows into that war declaration. It says, yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya, so the Malaysian islands. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong, China. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam, a known American territory nowadays. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands, which would in turn be a major campaign in World War II. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island, and this morning, they had attacked Midway Island. So Wake Island and Midway were also two major battles at sea. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. So he's saying, hey, I'm the head honcho. This is going to happen. Respect. Anyways, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people and their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. So he's saying that and the Japanese kind of betrayed the trust between them and the United States. Hostilities exist. Pretty straightforward. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare. Okay, so this is kind of like the concluding statement, pretty straightforward. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. Here's a side note about that. Less than 24 hours after the receipt of the first news of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the president had actually drove to the Capitol to deliver the foregoing message to a joint session of the Senate and House Representatives. The president spoke grimly for 6.5 hours, I believe. Yeah, pretty wild, honestly. That was his famous "A Day Which Will Live in Infamy" speech, which would in turn declare war on Japan. A side note as well is the Japanese admiral. I might butcher this, bear with me, but Admiral Yamamoto Izuroku. He had famously said after the attack, and in response to the Americans, the famous phrase, "I fear that we may have awoken a sleeping giant." Well, I say to that admiral, yeah, you did. The next 3 or 4 years, I think, kind of proved that point. Anyways, so here's the other thing that I had about that is what's referred to as the backdoor to war theory. The mainstream response of that theory is most historians have rejected the claims as reductionist and unconvincing. These historians do agree that Roosevelt engaged in deception and manipulation to advance his foreign policies, and that he was prevented from seeking a formal declaration of war in the first years of the fighting because of continued public support for United States neutrality. So this was a common trend for the United States to stay completely neutral in most conflicts, and kind of repeating history, to be quite exact, repeating almost exactly what had happened in World War One, when President Wilson was very adamant about staying neutral from the war in Europe, saying, "Well, we're doing our own thing. You guys do you." But we're going to be right here doing our own thing, in layman's terms. But anyways, nevertheless, they argue that this does not show that President Roosevelt intentionally provoked the Japanese to attack the United States, or that he allowed the country to be surprised at Pearl Harbor. So the preceding events that I had mentioned prior obviously shows that they had plenty of warning. These guys stationed here had spotted a submarine. They had seen the flights heading towards Pearl Harbor, but had mistaken it for B-17s. Several other warnings, and they chose to ignore it, and that's unfortunately what led to the attack. So obviously, a lesson learned there. Here's the problem of public opinion, though. Although there is no question that Roosevelt was concerned about public support for entering the war, this was not because he thought he could not obtain a declaration without it. In late 1941, before the Pearl Harbor attack, he had enough votes in Congress to pass a formal declaration of war. Rather, according to most historians, his concern was that Americans would not be able to sustain such enormous effort with all of its sacrifice of blood and treasure, unless they were united in the spirit of a moral crusade. So that was kind of like the war cry, death to the Japanese. The actual attack itself had sparked this intense hatred for anything and anyone Japanese. And during the war, that's actually what led to the internment camps of several Japanese Americans who were actually very loyal to, the United States. So that's a separate issue. I'm sure if you guys want to hear anything about that, please let me know in the comments, and I'll look it up for you. But one dissenting vote from the declaration of war was kind of interesting, really. A representative from the state of Montana, Jeanette Rankin, actually had given the exact same, like, we shouldn't go to war vote back in World War I. So that's obviously another instance of repeating history. Anyways, back to that. So the problem of public opinion. Accordingly, in his major foreign policy decisions regarding the war in Europe in the early years, he was careful not to commit the country to greater involvement in the fighting than public opinion would support. So he was definitely a man of the people in this instance, or at least trying to be. The draft, a destroyer basis exchange, the Lend-Lease program, referring to the Lend-Lease Act, convoying and economic sanctions against Japan were all undertaken with Roosevelt's belief that the public regarded them as vital to American national security. Contrary to the revisionist view, most historians regard these incremental decisions not as attempts to drag the country into the war, but rather as efforts by President Roosevelt to exercise all other options, in keeping with his deep reluctance to enter the fighting without the firm support of the American public. So that last bit there was pretty straightforward, saying if the United States does not support this idea, I'm not going to be eager to jump right into war. Although Roosevelt did admit to then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, who would be the other two major superpowers at the time, the British and Russians, that it would have been difficult to gain public support for war without the Japanese attack. Nevertheless, according to most historians, he actually tried to avoid a war with Japan throughout 1941, fearing that it would limit America's aid to Britain and lengthen the struggle against Germany. So a little bit of analysis about that. That kind of emphasizes that letter that he had sent to the emperor, hoping for a last effort of peace. But by doing so, this hopefully wouldn't have limited the United States supporting Britain and France in their war in Europe, and hopefully not lengthen the struggle against Germany, making it a fairly short war. For example, in a discussion of the American embargo, so this is the Embargo Act, which was another attempt at trying to keep Japan away from China, on Japan at a cabinet meeting on November 7th, 1941, he had stated that the administration should strain every nerve to satisfy and keep on good relations with Japanese negotiators. So essentially saying they should do everything they possibly can to keep the peace with Japan, but at the same time stand up for themselves. He told Secretary of State Cordell Hull not to let the talks deteriorate and break up if you can possibly help it. So it's absolutely vital that they should not piss off the Japanese. Let us make no move of ill will. Let us do nothing to precipitate a crisis. So this was actually another thing. This was President Roosevelt's sent warnings of a Japanese attack from his perspective. So him and his advisors did foresee a Japanese military action on December 6th through the 7th. Nevertheless, most historians agree that they did not know where the attack would come. So he kind of had an idea that this was going to happen, but he didn't know where. Intercepted Japanese diplomatic and military messages indicated an attack somewhere, but information suggesting that the target would be British, Dutch, or French possessions in Southeast Asia. So these were areas in Indochina where he had stated in his letter. Obscured other information suggesting Pearl Harbor. Moreover, as most historians point out, it is implausible to think that Roosevelt, a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, would have exposed so much of the United States fleet to destruction at Pearl Harbor had he known an assault was coming. And obviously that is one reason why Admiral Kimmel was relieved of duty, because he made that decision to bundle up the ships in Battleship Row. If his only purpose was to use a Japanese attack to bring the United States into the war, he could have done so with the loss of just a few destroyers and some airplanes. Like, okay, well, we've only lost a couple. We can still get into the fight. In fact, he was genuinely surprised by the target, if not the timing, of the Japanese attack. According to one scholar, Roberta Wohlstetter, this was partly the consequence of a tendency among United States military leaders to see the fleet in Hawaii as a deterrent rather than a target. And that was in part to the admiral in general thinking, well, they're not going to see us as a target. Why would they attack us? It was also the result of a failure by the United States military intelligence. Trust me, not the first time, not the last time either, to measure Japanese capabilities accurately. The Americans did not believe that Japanese air and naval forces could mount a successful attack on the United States bases in Hawaii. Most historians believe that there was no backdoor to war, hint, hint, and no conspiracy to trick the American public into a conflict it did not wish to fight in either Europe or Asia. American involvement in World War II, they argue, was the consequence of the country's rise to global power and the resulting need to combat aggressive, undemocratic regimes that were hostile to American institutions and to the survival of the United States as a free country. So, basically what they're saying is that historians say, well, there was no preempted plan to have us fight Japan and Germany and Italy. But they do argue that since the United States was a superpower, it would become a target. And with a threat of the Axis powers, that was inevitable. That was going to happen. Or at least there was a good chance of it. However, this controversy has continued to be relevant in American political debate, sometimes even today. Despite suggestions that Congress was validating the theory, its defense authorization bill in the year 2000, so 22 years ago, included a provision that would absolve Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, the military commanders of Pearl Harbor, of any blame for Japan's attack. So this is kind of, even though they were relieved of duty after the attack, this bill would say, well, it wasn't their fault, declaring that they were not provided necessary and critical intelligence that would have alerted them to prepare for the attack. Okay, now, this is just my 2 cents. I'm sure I definitely don't agree with that. I think that they had plenty of warning. It was just the idea of their ego getting to them, saying that Hawaii wasn't a target. Like, why would they attack us? They've had plenty of warning and pretty obvious detail this was going to happen. So in some ways, they didn't expect it to happen. It was in some ways completely preventable. But you see where it's kind of complicated. But anyways, yes, that is my bit on that. And that is all I have for that. As a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor, that is what led the United States to be involved in World War II. Eventually, leading to the dropping of the atomic and hydrogen bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which would in turn end the war in Japan. And this was following the supposed death of Adolf Hitler and his wife Eva Braun in Germany as the Soviets were reaching Berlin before us, the Americans. The Americans were still kind of crossing the Rhine at that point. Yeah, tell me what you guys think on the video, and have a great night, guys. CG Money out.